Welcome back in to Cover Crimson. My name is Emily Grace McWhorter, and I join Clint Lamb every Monday and Wednesday at 9:30 a.m. Central to talk some Alabama football and give you a rundown of what's going on this week inside that facility. Clint, how are we this morning?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm excited. Today, we are going to be starting something that will actually take us quite a few episodes, really till the middle of February, really. And that is a rating of Clint's, I guess, opinion, you could say, a sliding scale of what he feels like each position group is at right now, currently. So we're going to start things off with the wide receivers and defensive backs. Clint, let's start off with those wide receivers. Give me your rating on those returning guys. Then we'll talk about those transfers and who Alabama is adding.
First of all, what are we doing this? Like, is it out of 10? Is it out of 5? Is it like a 4-star, 5-star, 3-star? Like, how you want to do it? It's totally up to you. And it really is just.
Clint, with things like this, typically you decide that beforehand, but we're going to decide it in the moment. I like stars. Let's do stars.
Okay. Yeah. And anywhere from 1 to 5 stars.
1 to 5.
5-star being the best, obviously, just like in recruiting.
Of course.
So Alabama does have quite a bit coming back. Like, you look at what happened going from 2023 to 2024 and kind of what all they lost. Amari Nyblack, you got Isaiah Bond, just several players. Now you've got Ron Williams, your number 1 receiver, Jeremy Bernard coming back, a couple of guys who had gotten banged up and who were supposed to be a major part of the rotation, Cole Adams and Jalen Hill. You've got Rico Scott, who played a lot in the bowl game. You got Jalen Mbakwe, who I guess we'll consider a returning player, even though he's new to receiver. So he's kind of like a new addition to that room. But then you also got Bubba Hampton. So they did lose a lot to the transfer portal, way more than your average team. But when you actually look and see what they were able to return, I actually feel pretty good about the returning guys, and then who you added as well through, Isaiah Horton kind of being that big bodied X receiver, Derek Meadows kind of being in that same mold, but a little bit raw, like Zaire Brooks. So, I mean, between the returning guys and the additions there, I think it's a really good group. Do you want me to go ahead and give a rating now, or do you want to talk about it and then kind of, because sometimes, you might say something that made me feel better about it, or, ask a question that kind of jogs something a little bit. So we can talk about it a little bit, chew on it, and then I can give something at the end with it.
I like that, Clint. And I want to start with this. So you mentioned that Alabama did see quite a few departures in that wide receiver room. What would you attribute that to? And kind of going forward, do you expect that to continue to happen, or what's the deal there?
Well, what's interesting about it is kind of going into 2024, we talked about all of the slot options, the inside options that Alabama had. It felt like Kendrick Law was more of a slot guy. We knew Kobe Prentice was almost exclusively slot. Jeremy Bernard had some inside out ability. Ron Williams was more of a perimeter, but he could play some slot. You had a bunch of different guys who could play inside. But as far as true, pure outside options, they were very limited on the roster. Jalen Hill was supposed to be one of them. He can play in the slot, but you could view him kind of as exclusively an outside guy if you wanted to. But that was kind of a concern, especially with, the kind of the way that Kalen DeBoer likes to operate, and the fact that you were kind of lacking size, that Rome Odunze type of player. It made you at least question, okay, how is it going to look? Obviously, there's going to need to be some things adjusted with this wide receiver room to make it work. But, a lot of people, myself included, were hoping that over the course of the season, a guy like Caleb Odom, who brought that size, going in very, he's young. He was a freshman. He had, a lot of people expected him to play tight end. Now, he did play a lot of receiver in high school, so it's not like he was new to the position, but just there was a lot of hope that maybe he could take over that size role. And at least carve out, and he did to an extent, like as far as playing time, but as far as targets and things like that, like he kind of made up for the blocking out on the perimeter while Kendrick Law was hurt. He did get that one start against Mercer, but I look at the wide receiver room and the guys they lost. Kendrick Law, the type of role that he had in Alabama's offense didn't really feature him a lot. I don't think he was really going to fit what Alabama was wanting to do in that room in 2025. Kobe Prentice, it was pretty obvious, he had experience and they relied on him a little bit, but it was, going into the year, we knew Law was going to have some type of role. We had heard Cole Adams was running with the ones. You also had Ryan Williams, a true freshman, coming in, Jeremy Bernard, a transfer coming in. Both of those two guys were running there at the top. So it kind of seemed like Kobe Prentice had already fallen out of favor a little bit. So him leaving wasn't surprising. Caleb Odom, they really needed that true outside option that could handle the size element or add that to the offense. Caleb Odom wasn't really ready for that role. He was, I think the staff more so viewed him as a tight end in a wide receiver's body.
Yeah.
And so, he wanted to continue to play exclusively wide receiver. I don't know if that would have continued to be the case at Alabama. So, there's nobody that really entered that shocked me. But I think with what they had coming back, what you needed to add to complement that through, we talk about that size element. I think Alabama did a phenomenal job because last year they were limited pretty much exclusively to a first-year player with that. And you had to get development in order to have that element within your offense. But this year, you do lose Caleb Odom, and he would have brought more experience next year, but you replace him with a guy in Isaiah Horton who brings that size, has that experience, brings that element. And also you went and got Derek Meadows, who's a raw young prospect who you can develop and kind of mold behind Isaiah Horton to where you can get both the immediate and the future out of it as well. I mean, I think that's absolutely huge for the wide receiver room.
Yeah, and one thing too about Caleb Odom is Caleb Odom had such high praise when I was down there, especially in fall camp. I remember Coach Brian Ellis, who was the tight ends coach, saying, I wish I still had him in my position group because he's just an athlete. So when he did hit the portal, I felt like you mentioned that Mercer game, and there were a few moments where he was so close. It was like, okay, he's starting to step into that wide receiver role, but like you said, it just never seemed to fully come together. But he's an insane athlete. And did you see what he actually tweeted last night about the Alabama game?
No, I didn't. I didn't at all.
Okay, fill some time here while I pulled up because I don't want to say anything.
So Alabama played Ole Miss last night. He was at Alabama. He transferred to Ole Miss, so I'm guessing he was quite happy with the result, is what I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you have not kept up with Alabama basketball, which if you're here, I'm sure you have somewhat of a handle on it, but that was the first time that Alabama had lost at home in a minute, and it was just a sloppy game all around. Me and Jim Dunaway were there last night, and Caleb Odom tweets out, "Good win at Ole Miss men's basketball."
So kept it simple, but
kept it simple.
I'm sure the applause from Alabama fans were quite level-headed. No one overreacted and took some personal shots or anything. I have no idea. Maybe they were great.
Honestly, there's not as many as I was expecting, but definitely we can't share most of them on a family-friendly show like this one at Cover Crimson. But yeah, there was definitely some super level-headed responses mixed in.
I mean, you can't. He's happy for his current school, and this is kind of what people talk about, kind of the loyalties. They change awfully quick. And he's still got a lot of teammates in Tuscaloosa. He's still got friendships, and I'm sure there's no hate, but I'm sure that had to feel pretty good for him. But I mean, I think Alabama fans right now, when you're talking about Caleb Odom versus Isaiah Horton and Derek Meadows, I think you got to feel pretty good about that trade.
Yeah. What do you think when it comes to Isaiah Horton specifically, what do you think the pitch was from the coaching staff to get him on this roster?
Rome Odunze, and just the success that he had at Washington, I think is pretty simple. And granted, Isaiah Horton's not necessarily the same guy. I'm not saying he's going to be a number, a top 10 pick in the NFL draft, and he's some sort of just absolute freak at the position, but he adds a lot of the elements. Typically those bigger body receivers, that win downfield, they can win the 50-50 stuff. They don't have the ability to kind of run a larger portion of the route tree than you would anticipate. The suddenness and everything from a lot of these guys, it's just really not there. So they're kind of limited. They do bring a very important element, and they're, a mismatch problem down there near the goal line and all that stuff. But I think Isaiah Horton, kind of like Rome Odunze, he can do more. He can win over the middle of the field, short to intermediate stuff, good route runner. Really was relied on in a lot of clutch situations, at least in the Miami games that I watched, where it's a 3rd and 7, and they're going to Isaiah Horton. And he was really viewed as anywhere from the wide receiver 3 to the wide receiver 4. Now going into next year is projected to be the 1. But, I think just the pitch for him was pretty simple because in a lot of ways you can put on Rome Odunze's tape and say, we're going to use you pretty much like this. And that, did result in him being a top 10 draft pick, having a lot of success as far as awards, postseason awards, production. And so, you've got a guy like Ryan Williams, you got a guy like Jeremy Bernard, but the sell there too is, hey, we had McMillan there at Washington. We had Bernard as our wide receiver 4. We had Jalen Polk. We had Roma Dunze, and we featured all of them. All of them got recognition. 3 of those guys, Bernard's obviously at Alabama now, but the other 3 ended up being day 1, day 2 draft picks. So even though you've got a bona fide one and Williams, and you got another guy in Bernard and some other guys who can get in that mix too, and Hell and Cole Adams and Rico Scott, maybe Jalen Mbakwe. I think Isaiah Horton was sold on the fact of the way that this offense is supposed to operate when it's got a quarterback who can do everything that we ask it to do within our offense. We don't have to adjust to them. There's plenty of room for multiple receivers to have success, and I think that was the big selling point for him.
We haven't even talked about Ryan Williams too much, but what are you expecting from him in this next season? From what I've heard, that he's really stepped into more of a leadership role, and I'm curious to, as this quarterback battle begins, what we'll kind of begin to see from inside the facility, especially come spring practice and then going into fall camp. But what are you expecting from Ryan Williams' leadership perspective and him leading this room?
I think he earned a lot of people's respect for A, how he approached his business, but B, as like a young receiver who is supposed to be Mr. Everything. Cam Coleman started off kind of rocky for Auburn, and then he really started to turn it on down the stretch. He really started to catch his stride, no pun intended. You look at, Jeremiah Smith, and he was pretty much dominant for Ohio State all year. Ryan started off the season extremely well, was very much on pace to clear 1,000 yards receiving, and then it wasn't his role fell off necessarily, but I think him personally, he kind of hit a little bit of a freshman wall. He had some struggles, which was to be expected. I don't know if anybody knows this, but he's only 17 years old. We can only say that for another month. But, and so like when you look at him and the way that he handled it, it's like people were asking him, they're trying to kind of get, I'm not saying that the intention was to get a rise out of him after the LSU game, but it's like they're asking him questions to see, how do you feel about, your role and things like that. And he's doing nothing but praising Jalen Milroe. Hey, we're scoring points, we're winning games. I do not care. For such a young player who started off the year so well, to handle it in the way that he handled it, to not let his frustrations get the best of him, I think he earned, and also just like I said, the way he went about his business, the production they did have, the fact that he showed everybody, I'm a future bona fide number 1 receiver. I think that combination really grabbed the locker room, and they have a lot of respect for him. So I mean, with him continuing to get older and more mature and work on some of the nuanced things that he needs to work on, having a full off season in the program, I think that's going to do nothing but help him. And I think he's going to end up having a tremendous 2025 season where he is one of the top receivers in all of college football.
Before we move on to the DBs, I do want to say something. So you mentioned how people were trying to get a rise out of him by asking those questions. So when he actually said that quote about Jalen Milroe, this was after LSU, and he praised him. It was actually my question. It was to him. So my question was, what are your thoughts on Jalen? Like, tell me about it, y'all's relationship. And the way that those media scrums work, especially with players, is that they throw out 4 or 5 guys all at once. So you kind of have to discern, okay, who do I need priority-wise? Because it could be Malachi, Tyler Booker, Ryan Williams all at once. And so the crowd kind of thinned out with Ryan. And so I'm standing there, and so few people had that quote, because I think it was me and maybe one other person. And I was not expecting him to tell that story of them on the sidelines of the LSU game. And if you're not familiar with this, sidelines of LSU, Jalen comes over to the receiver, specifically Ryan, and is like, sorry guys, basically, because they're not getting a lot of touches in that game. And Ryan immediately said, we don't care if we're winning. That's more important than whatever personal accolades basically that I can get. And I was so impressed with him then. That was also the day that I asked about his nails, and they were painted Mardi Gras colors. No one really knew the story on that, especially heading into LSU week. It's a little like, oh man, is this how you're, going to go toe to toe with them? His response was, he's from the real Mardi Gras in Mobile.
Yeah, which I thought was also a great answer. Just a really impressive kid. And what I love about this wide receiver room is you got, Horton's going to play exclusively on the outside. I mean, he played like 5% of his snaps in the slot. But, a guy like Jeremy Bernard, he kind of split his time between inside and outside. So he can play the Z, he can play the H. You got a guy like Rico Scott who can kind of come in. He can play the Z, he can play the H. When Cole Adams is on the field and it's Ryan Williams, Jeremy Bernard, and Cole Adams, I'm assuming that because Ryan can play the X or the Z. He's been playing the X. He can play on the line of scrimmage, despite the fact that he's kind of a little light. He's actually really good at getting off press coverage. Very effective at that for someone his size. But you can kind of move different guys around. Adams is more of a pure slot. You can move Bernard out to the Z. You can move Ryan to the X, and you can get Cole Adams on the field. Or, if you bring on Rico Scott, he can replace either one you're wanting to give a breather to, whether it be Bernard in the slot, whether it be Ryan Williams. Like I said, Ryan Williams can go to the X and replace Horton. Just a lot of versatility. A guy like Jalen Mbakwe, we don't really know what to expect from him. But Jalen Hell, he can play in the slot some, but he's more of an outside replacement, more of an X replacement, in my opinion. But just a very collectively versatile group where you can have guys playing different roles. No one's really stuck in one specific role. Even a guy like Isaiah Horton, I think he could play the Z. I think he could play the X. I just think he's mostly going to be playing on the outside. But I really like this group. So do you want me to go ahead and give a star rating to this?
Let's do it.
I won't go 5 stars yet, just because we need to see some of the development. And there's only 10 players in the room, which I think is okay to an extent. But and I don't know what you do at this point to kind of combat that. Like, who are you going to go out and get at this point when you've got all these different options that we've been talking about? But I would say I'll give them 4 stars because, you've got a bona fide pure number one. You've got a guy who is actually more consistent and reliable as your number 2 in Jeremy Bernard. You've got a guy like Isaiah Horton who provides that complementary element. And so, I really like the starting unit. I like the guys who are coming back to add depth. I feel very confident with 4 stars, and who knows, maybe before the season that even gets it bumped up to 5.
All right, we did get a little darker over here on my end. The light died, but we're going to keep going. No big deal. Let's move on to defensive backs. Give me your thoughts, and then we'll round out with a rating for this group.
Damani Jackson coming back is so big. Because now you've got both your guys returning from last year, both your starters, which is, look at just last year, you had a new guy, like your most experienced guy, Damani Jackson, was a transfer. He was new and trying to get acclimated to the new environment, the new system, all of that stuff. But then, what typically would have been a loss in Jalen Mbakwe kind of being your number 3 and moving to the offensive side of the football, then you go out and you get Cam Calhoun, who's a young player. He's gotten a lot of run there at Utah. He was not a full-time starter, or even, I think he only got a couple of starts, but he played a ton, kind of like Jalen Mbakwe. He was kind of their version of Mbakwe in a lot of ways. Was one of the most sought-after cornerbacks in the transfer portal. He comes in, and the only reason I don't have him as a starter is because of Damani Jackson coming back. And so you assume the guys who started this year are going to start next year because they were both really effective. And, Xavier Brown was a true freshman. You only expect growth from him. But Cam Calhoun, he sits as that number 3 for a year, that Trey Amos type of role. Damani Jackson finishes out strong next year. Then Cam Calhoun can step up into his spot, the following year, if it's not Dijon Lee. Because, so your top 3 are still filled out. You got really good experience there at the top, whether it be starting or with Calhoun, just pure experience of playing. And then you've got young talent and 2 top 100 players. Dijon Lee, a 5-star, Chuck McDonald ranked in, I think, the top 80, top 75. Lee is a guy who I think could very much contribute early because you do have the 3 in front of him. I don't know how much he will play as a freshman, but I think he's got the ability to play husky with the physicality. I think he's got the ability to play on the outside. Very rare size and athleticism combination, and just playing a lot of the cover 3 like you're going to see under Kane Womack. That style of player with that size, kind of the Legion of Boom days with the Seattle Seahawks, where it's very tough to get footballs over them, when they're sitting down in coverage. And so I would fully expect him to contribute at least in some capacity in 2025. And he could just be good enough where you really can't keep him off the field. Maybe you find somewhere where you can kind of play him situationally. Maybe there's a matchup with a size receiver where you're like, we can match that size with this unicorn and Dijon Lee. But just I really like, whether it be, the top or the bottom of the depth chart, Love that position group. And you got Deshaun Jones, who I'm currently slotting in as kind of the Husky because you do have those 3 perimeter guys we just talked about. But in a lot of situations, had Damani Jackson left, you could have seen a battle between Deshaun Jones and Cam Calhoun to see who started opposite Xavier Brown. So he has perimeter quarterback traits. He's also extremely physical. We showed that this past season, and I think he'll do well at Husky. But he adds to that room where if you start taking some hits as far as your depth, you can kick him back outside, and you can get a guy like Red Morgan or maybe Zay Mincy comes in as kind of a third safety at Husky, or Dijon Lee comes in at Husky or whatever, but you can keep some experience on the outside. So kind of like the receivers, it's kind of the same thing. Love the returning guys, love the experience depth that they have, and they have a lot of talent that they've brought in to kind of fill out that depth.
How do you anticipate this group complementing Kane Womack's defense going forward? And do you expect any growth from that area, or what are you thinking there?
Yeah, I mean, just I think there's ball skills there. I think I think the production's going to go not only to the extent of, there's going to be certain guys that certain offenses are not wanting to test. With Damani Jackson, he doesn't seem like a guy that you want to test. He's got great cover skills, the ball skills. He actually made some strides. He got an interception this year, maybe even 2, but I know at least 1. So first career interception, that was kind of his big problem at USC. He had all the traits that you look for, but for whatever reason, just the ball skills and actually being able to bring in the football weren't always there. But I think we saw some growth on that front. But he's a guy that you really don't want to throw at. Xavier Brown, kind of the same way. So I think production, as an offense, when you get out there, it's like, okay, who do we want to target? Like, who's going to be our go-to guy? This past year, it's like, well, we'll go after the freshman all day, every day. And Damani Jackson's kind of a guy who you weren't scared. You weren't going to shy away from him. But when you had options of this first-year player who's still kind of getting his footing a little bit, he's kind of learning the nuances of playing on this level. That's probably our safest best bet. Now he's going to be a year older. He's got the experience factor. He kind of made some game-changing plays towards the end of some games. South Carolina, not South Carolina, but Georgia. What was the other one? Tennessee, maybe?
Tennessee.
I think he made and I'm not talking interceptions. I'm talking about just big, timely plays. I really like the group, EG, and I think that Kane Womack, when you talk about wanting to make his defense work, the more that you can take off of their plate, the more, I think it's going to complement what they do up front quite well, because they don't really pressure to sacks. They pressure to turnovers, and you've got guys in the back end that could capitalize on that.
All right, give us that rating. I'm excited to hear.
I actually feel really good about the cornerback room specifically. And granted, we could probably even extend this to secondary. We're going to be doing the safeties with the quarterbacks in another episode, but when you're looking exclusively at the corners, and it's crazy how quickly they turn this room around. And when you take a 5-star freshman like Jalen Ibakwe out of it, who had seen playing time, who was more ready to contribute than we were anticipating, you move a guy like Zay Mincy, another 5-star who came in as a corner. Now he's playing safety. It's like when you would typically remove those 2 caliber of players, it's like, okay, the depth took a major hit at this spot. But like I said, top experience, production, talent, the ability to push elite status. The number 3, as good as you could possibly want or need. Back half of your depth is fantastic. You got the flexibility with Deshaun Jones. I'm going to give it 5 stars. A lot of people might be surprised that I put the corners over the receivers as far as the star rating, but this group has a chance to be one of the best cornerback rooms, and that includes what we've seen recently with Kool-Aid McKinstry and Terrion Arnold. And some of those guys, I think this group has a chance to end up being very productive in Kane Womack's defense starting in 2025, but really beyond that too.
All right, Clint, that is going to do it for today's episode of Cover Crimson. Thank you as always. And guys, we're going to continue this series of comparing some position groups and getting Clint's 5-star rating, hopefully, or maybe there might be some lower stars in there. We'll have to see. But again, this will take us up until probably mid-February. By the time we get through it all, we'll have some breaking news thrown in the mix and whatever else we can, find and dig up for you guys. But as always, thank you for tuning in. My name is Emily Grace McWhorter. This is Clint Lamb. Make sure you're following us on social media. Clint, where can they find us?
CoverCrimson.com, message board, just went through a couple of days ago, did the depth chart projections with roles, specific roles. Going to be looking at some other stuff that I found pretty fascinating as far as returning production on snaps and starts and who they're adding, and you can get an idea of all that. So a lot going on at covercrimson.com. And of course, you can find us on Twitter as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Don't forget to like this video, share it wherever you can. We appreciate you guys, and EG, I appreciate you.
Absolutely. All right, guys, we'll see you next time.